Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ADGM webcast series. My name is Martin Tideström, and I'm really looking forward to this session. It's great to have you with us, speakers and audience. Thank you for participating. We have done 3 webcasts so far, averaging 4,000 people each watching, many of you actively. This is fantastic. It indicates we're on the right track in bringing across relevant content, helping you and your businesses in these unprecedented times. We want to continue doing this, so please let us know what you want to hear about and if you have expertise to share. Many of you have done that. We have a strong program ahead with great partners and speakers addressing current challenges and COVID-related change around areas like cash management, accounting, cybersecurity, export finance, and supply chain management. It's also giving longer-term perspectives with economists explaining what's going on in the world and what we can expect here. Banks and big investors sharing how their expectations and preferences are impacted, and senior government officials talking about support programs and plans to boost the economy. Today, our topic is corporate debt restructuring. Unfortunately, more companies more and more find themselves in distress these days, and many others see clouds gathering on the horizon. That, of course, doesn't mean the game is over. There are ways of dealing with problems. And today we'll talk about one that many of you want to understand better. Here to help us are 2 leading advisors in the field. Nicola Reader, expert on restructuring and insolvency from Clifford, and Tom Howitt, director in Deloitte's financial advisory team. With your perspectives, the legal and the financial commercial, I know we'll all learn a lot. We have an hour today, and we'll start by setting the scene, explaining what a corporate debt restructuring process actually is. We look at the why, the when, the who the stakeholders are to involve in something like this, and at some of the dynamics, the complexities and choices involved in the process. As usual, we're happy to address feedback from those of you who listen in. Please post on the social media channels you're watching on. Our teams are monitoring all and will forward your questions to us. If we run out of time, Nick and Tom have kindly agreed to go through the feed afterwards and make sure you all get help. That is why we're here. With that, let's start. To our speakers, Nick and Tom, it's really great to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks, Martin. My name is Nicola Reader, and I'm counsel in the financial markets practice at Clifford, and I specialise in restructurings. I qualified into the restructuring department in our London office, and I moved out to the region 5 years ago, and I've worked on a range of regional and international restructurings. And today I'm joined by Tom from Deloitte.
Thanks, Nikki. Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Howitt, and I'm a director in the restructuring services team at Deloitte. I specialise in supporting a variety of stakeholders through a debt restructuring process, as well as working on business transformation and turnaround work. I have 10 years of restructuring experience, split pretty evenly between the UK and the Middle East, where I now focus on the UAE market and specifically Abu Dhabi. I'm delighted to be here, so let's start the show and we'll move to our presentation. Perfect. So some of you may be glad to hear that our presentation is only one slide, but don't worry. Following this, we'll move very quickly to our Q&A session. So hopefully everyone can see the screen on screen. I can. So here, Nikki and I have tried to outline at a relatively high level what a generic financial restructuring process should look like. Before we go through this in more detail, I think it's worth highlighting some key points. So clearly all processes are unique. The process will be generally driven by different stakeholders, the sector within which the company operates, the capital structure of that business. These will all differ, but it will all generally have one common theme. The company has gone through a decision whether it's a fix, sell, or close, and decided that closure is not the optimal solution, and therefore a restructuring process is the best way to go. So the general aim of a structured process is to avoid legal enforcement by a creditor, and thereby maintaining business operations and preserving value. So hopefully it goes without saying that active stakeholder management and robust independent advice along the way should drive to a consensual solution. Nikki, do you want to add anything at this stage?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think by the same measure, you do need to have an understanding of what that enforcement scenario might look like, because it will be the yardstick against which proposals are measured by the stakeholders. And I think it's also important to work out whether restructuring is something that's worth fighting for, because, as you say, in most situations, that's the best way to preserve value. But you definitely don't want to spend time and effort negotiating a restructuring only to conclude it would have been a better outcome from everyone if you just walked away quietly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So if we start on the left-hand side of the screen here, and we start with the liquidity analysis, this is the logical point to start in any process. So really the key thing here is for the stakeholders as a group to form a robust view on the cash headroom in the business, both in the short term and in the more medium term. The reason for that is a process will naturally last months and not weeks. And unexpectedly running out of cash partway through a process, can, in my experience, at best delay and at worst derail a process entirely. So avoiding that burning platform scenario provides greater optionality during the process, which again is preserving value. Nikki, do you want to take us through the security review and debt mapping elements?
Sure, yeah. So while Tom and his team will be busy looking at liquidity issues, the lawyers will typically get on with looking at the security and debt position of creditors, which is just critical for understanding, their relative positions. And, before you determine your game strategy, you need to know who the players are and on what team they're on. So we'll typically look at things like who's got security, what assets have they got security over, are there any intercreditor arrangements in place? And actually, who are the creditors? Because they can all have quite different perspectives. So, a day one lender who's originated the deal at 100 cents in the dollar is going to have a very different perspective from someone who's bought in the secondary market. We'll also look at whether there's any significant trade creditors or any related party claims. And you'll use that to just get a picture of the relative position of the stakeholders, and that's what you'll use to frame your restructuring proposals. So I'll pass back to you, Tom, for business planning.
Yeah, so once you've got comfortable around liquidity, you've bought some time to run a proper process. There's greater clarity around what the lenders and secured position is. Then you're into the business planning process, and really, from my experience, most successful processes are underpinned by a robust business plan. And what we mean by that is something that gives all stakeholders comfort over the cash generation potential of the business, or at least to within an acceptable range. Because really, this is what provides that common platform and information base across all the stakeholders. Once you have a plan that generates a cash flow available for debt service number, a CFADS number, the CFADS is the CFADS, and therefore, there is a one point of the truth to base a restructuring around. Now, clearly this is challenging at the moment, given COVID-19 and current market conditions are creating uncertainty, arguably more uncertainty than many of us have ever seen before. However, businesses do still need to present a range of scenarios to stakeholders and their view on those scenarios, so people can make informed choices and increase the likelihood of a successful process. So this step is still very important, even given the challenges that are happening right now. And I think the only other piece I'd mention on the business planning process is what we've seen recently, it's extremely important to make sure that there are performance improvement initiatives and potential liquidity solutions overlaid to the plan. So even a banking case business plan should be able to consider some upsides, and there should be some mechanisms that are thought through to deal with it. So I think what the last thing that particularly secured lenders like is having to take write-offs or take pain on a restructuring for the business to start paying dividends shortly thereafter. So there does need to be a bit of a compromise. And once you've aligned on the plan, then you're into the options analysis piece. And really, I guess a key point here is, and we've outlined some of the options, at least at a high level here on the page. And I guess one thing I'd say is, all potential options as part of this process need to be considered in detail before being discounted. What we've seen in processes where people are too narrow in their thinking, this can create disharmony, I guess, amongst stakeholders. So therefore, it's very important to consider all options on the table, and where options are discounted, making sure there's clear clarity as to why. So as you can see, potential options can range from very simple solutions to much more complex transactions. And it's very common for a successful process to involve a number of solutions, which sometimes are implemented in parallel and in combination to each other. If a deal can be agreed with a shareholder injection and a straightforward rescheduling of debt, great, fantastic, and that's what stakeholders should aim for. But if not, then more creative solutions need to be considered, which could include retrenching the debt, potentially selling the debt assets for companies sell assets, or running a fast track M&A process for parts or all of the business. Nikki, I know legal analysis can play a key role here. Do you want to walk us through some of that thinking as well?
Yeah, sure. So I think from a legal perspective, what you're really looking at is implementation and how you're going to get from where you are now to the solution. And there are two big picture points that we'll look at. The first one is what consents do you need? Do all creditors need to consent? And the practical reality is that even when you've got syndicated loans in place, because the sort of changes that you want to make in a restructuring are likely to hit up against lender entrenched rights, so things like tenor extension, margin uplift, and that can often require 100% consent. So the two obvious ancillary questions to that are how you're going to get it, and if you don't get them, how you're going to solve for that. And the second question is, what's the timeline to implementation? So there's always going to be a practical question about drafting documents that you need in order to implement the deal, but sometimes there might be parts of the process that have specific timing constraints. So if you need to call a shareholders meeting, are there any notice requirements for that? If you've got a bond or a sukuk and you need to run a consent solicitation process, are there any notice periods of that? So we'll be looking at all of that kind of stuff. And then once we've sort of got a plan, we'll move towards negotiating, documenting, and implementing the deal. And from a legal perspective, creditors are often looking for additional protections and restrictions in restructuring documentation. So those are the sort of things that we'll help people with. So that might be enhanced information covenants or reporting obligations like cash flow forecasts, that kind of thing. Enhanced governance arrangements, maybe creditors want board observer rights or a strengthened management team. And they might want extra guarantees and security protection to just enhance the credit as much as they can. And I guess the two big points from my perspective are that, and that they're aligned, is that the legal documentation needs to align to the commercial objectives of the business. And it also needs to be practical. It's a tendency to think, well, it's a restructuring and they're distressed, so we need to tighten up the screws. But what you don't want is, you don't want a hair trigger on a financial covenant just 3 months after you've concluded a restructuring, and you don't want to weigh down management's time with reporting obligations if they're just going to not have time to focus on building the business and developing the business. So I'll leave you, Tom, to talk about it from a commercial perspective.
Yeah, I'd probably add a couple of things here. One being, we mentioned as part of that business planning phase, looking at strategic changes, performance improvement initiatives, etc. It's at this stage, at the back end of the deal, where it is important that those initiatives are in flight and you can demonstrate they're in flight, because the last thing you want is a business plan, a turnaround predicated on a number of initiatives that when you get to the documentation stage, nothing's been done about it for weeks and potentially a month plus. That creates concern amongst the stakeholders. So I think it's very important not to take the eye off the ball at that stage and make sure those initiatives are in flight. Second point would probably be around pricing. So I think, as part of this process, the pricing of the debt will likely change. From my experience, generally that is upwards overall. Lenders generally want an upfront one-off restructuring fee for rescheduling the debt. Again, this does depend on stakeholder dynamics and the underlying business and sector. We have seen scenarios where pricing is revised down if that's clearly the optimal or necessary solution, but that's not always the case. So that's something that's worth definitely bearing in mind at this stage and trying to negotiate in a fair and equitable way. So that concludes our presentation of the overall process, and I guess at this stage we'll move to some Q&A. Martin?
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, Tom. Really good overview and start of the discussion. And as I said before, we really welcome more and more questions from the audience as well. But let me start by drilling into one area that's interesting here. Why do people need to restructure? When should you start thinking about this? Tom, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Interesting question. I guess there's a few buckets. I guess there's a clear and obvious. A covenant has been breached. There's a forecast default or actual default on the debt. There's an inability to pay creditors, key suppliers, salaries on time. Something we see in this market quite often is businesses relying on short-term revolving facilities. If you're constantly running up to those facility rollover dates with insufficient liquidity, that could indicate that there's a need to restructure on a more holistic scale. And then there are some probably less subtle triggers in there as well. So, you may have a temporary issue with cash tied up in working capital or a one-off CapEx project, which, is creating a pinch point at a point in time, but a restructuring could provide a pretty easy solution for that. But even less subtle could be a change in terms with customers or suppliers. That may not be something that creates an issue today, but it may create an issue in a few months' time. And going for a restructuring earlier rather than later can sometimes, give you a better negotiating position at the table and lead to better terms. And then there's probably COVID-19 probably has its own bucket. The change in the market and macroeconomic conditions that we've seen. Some people will argue that they're temporary. Some people will suggest they're semi-permanent. But I guess there are multiple businesses out there right now who would benefit from additional liquidity to provide greater resilience to these conditions. And I guess for those who have more bigger decisions to make, shall we say, now is probably a good time to go and deal with them. I think from our perspective, restructuring, maybe pre-COVID could have been seen as a dirty word. I think now that stigma's kind of gone away a little bit. So now may be a good time to go and have these conversations. I guess finally as well, I probably should make the point around the more positive needs for sometimes for restructuring. And that could be businesses want additional finance or liquidity to take advantage of growth opportunities, both organic and inorganic. And again, a restructuring can prove a kind of low cost way of providing that additional liquidity and flexibility.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think just to add to that, one of the big battlegrounds in a restructuring is quite often directors' duties. So obviously, most jurisdictions place a variety of duties on directors, but where a company's in the zone of insolvency, those directors are often subject to additional duties, and the penalties can vary, but they can include criminal penalties and a requirement to contribute to the assets of the business. And so when you're a director, that's going to focus your mind quite closely. And you need to be particularly careful where a business has got a global footprint, because you should never assume anything in a restructuring. And one thing you should definitely never assume is that duties are the same across the board. So there are some jurisdictions where you've got very clear, hard, mandatory filing obligations. The one that springs to mind for me is Germany. If you've ever got a group with a German entity, there always needs to be quite a lot of focus at the beginning, because they have to file once the insolvency triggers are hit. They have to file within 3 weeks, otherwise they are going to be subject to civil and criminal penalties. And so that can just end up becoming a real battleground, and just making sure those people are comfortable so they don't have a precipitous filing. It might involve chucking money to the German sub, for example. And the later people come to the table, the more of a battleground that can be. And to give an example of how important it is, this has been the major focus in the global legislative reforms for COVID-19. That's what a lot of jurisdictions relax these requirements to file in the event of insolvency. So Germany has, for example, Spain has, the UK has, Australia has, and that's why. It's because this is really critical for why people end up in restructurings in the first place.
Great, thank you. Now, clearly from what you've said so far, there are a lot of players and parties involved in a restructuring. Are there any expectations on how they'll all behave? Nikki?
Yes, there are, or certainly sort of a guide. There's a set of principles called the INSOL principles, which were developed in London in the 1980s and the 1990s. So quite obviously before my time, Martin. But they've recently been amended with the involvement of local regional banks, and they set out a set of guidelines about how borrowers and creditors will behave. And they're all focused really around working together to rescue the business. So they include things like exercising restraint, trying to work together collectively, recognizing everybody's relative positions, giving a common access to information. And if a bank is prepared, or a creditor is prepared to inject new money into a difficult situation in order to fund the restructuring or fund the business while restructuring is ongoing, then that new money should get priority, and that's one of the principles. And they're not legally binding, but I do think that in a lot of restructurings, and including in regional restructurings, borrowers will often appeal to the INSOL principles, and restructurings often negotiated against the backdrop of those principles.
Great. I see questions start coming in from the audience. We'll start addressing them in a couple of moments. There are a few other sort of the setting the scene topics I think would be useful touching upon first. Another one of those is when you start thinking about a situation you're involved in, if it starts looking like you need financial restructuring, what are the things to consider? And I'm thinking from the perspective, mainly if you can address from the company, of course, but maybe also from its creditors, from its shareholders, to the extent they have not always aligned interests, and from your perspective as advisors. Tom?
Yeah. I mean, an interesting point you mentioned there, Martin. I think the views of the various stakeholders, not always are aligned. But I think my view would be at the start of a restructuring. I think there are still some common themes or common goals that apply to all stakeholders. I think everyone's trying to get to the same answers as quickly as possible. And while you may not get a robust answer in the first few weeks, I think what you're really trying to do is form a hypothesis on a key couple of questions here. And for me, that would be, number one, is the business model within the market that it operates sustainable and attractive long term? And I think for the current environment, that apply. COVID is making so much noise. You have to really form a hypothesis on, is this business and its model and its market sustainable in the long term post COVID? That is a fundamental question that everyone is seeking to answer. And then secondly, you have to form at least a working hypothesis, a working view on what are the options available, and are they realistically going to be achievable? because if you can answer potentially yes to both of those questions, then you move forward together, and that's when maybe part of the negotiation starts to come in. But I think for stakeholders in general, really there are two key buckets in trying to form a view and trying to work on a hypothesis. One would be around the commercial aspects, which would, I think, determine that a company and its advisors really need to perform a detailed and, I guess, honest assessment or reassessment of their market and of their competitive landscape. And by that I mean, they have to understand the real business dynamics, the service and products that they're offering. Are they still relevant to today? Do they have the same competitive advantage that the business may have had when starting out and setting up and being successful? Understanding demand and supply drivers is absolutely key here. What we generally encourage as advisors is making sure that senior management go to everyone in their business and make sure that they are speaking to customers, speaking to suppliers, collecting feedback around key themes like quality of service, price, terms that they're offering. All of these things are why people will choose you as a product provider or a service provider over the competition. So you really have to get to the nuts and bolts of are you fundamentally a good business still? And then key part of this is monitoring your competition. So understanding what are they doing with their pricing. Is the competition changing pricing terms in a COVID world, and do you need to match that? Can you match those terms? And then also more widely, what is happening with innovation in the market? We're seeing a lot of companies now using this downtime, if you like, to really try and differentiate. Digital transformation, I think, is something that's on everyone's agenda and everyone's pushing to try and differentiate to thrive when we come out of this COVID situation. On the more financial side, I think you're looking at, are covenants being met? Is default a real risk? Is there an imminent funding requirement? Is there an underlying profitable business? Can you strip back the noise and see whether there's an underlying profitable business here or not? And really understanding the capital structure, how complex is that, and how much can you get to the bottom of that? And I guess fundamentally from all of these things, you come to form the view that if a business cannot survive with its existing capital structure, then a financial restructuring is needed, and that's a simple fact. And then you're in the world of, again, coming back to the one pager that we put up, liquidity. I think we'd be encouraging companies to develop a short-term cash flow forecasting tool as much as possible. Weekly receipts and payments based tool that really gives that visibility on cash and embeds good behavior in the business. When you're in distress, cash should be the focus, not profit. And I guess on the business planning side, having a robust financial forecasting tool where you can flex input assumptions and play with different scenarios, from an operational, financial, and capital structuring perspective, they're really the building blocks to a really good financial restructuring process. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Nikki. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing coming out of what Tom was saying, which I completely agree with, is you can't get on top of the information too quickly in a restructuring. Just building your, every bit of information will just build your arsenal of weaponry. And when you're getting on top of that information, you need to look at it from the perspective of everyone. And I find that's particularly true when you're looking at from a legal perspective. So if you're a debtor and you're looking at your debt documents, you might be thinking, do I have headroom under my facilities? Can I access them? Is there a draw stop? But you probably also want to look at what the creditors might be thinking. Do they have a default? What can they do? What are the steps that they might take? I think I mentioned director's duty. So, if you're on debtor side or shareholder side, you might want to think about who you've got in management. Does that board need independent advice? Are they able? Are they capable? Have they got the skills that they need and the support they need to manage the situation? How are you going to communicate with creditors? General rule: the later you leave it, the less control that you'll have on the process and the outcome. So that's kind of always important. From a creditor perspective, you'll be trying to work out whether you've got a seat around the table. Is there a default now? Will there be a default when the grace periods expire? Will there be one soon? And if there is a default, what are you going to do? Do you want to reserve your rights? Will default interest or late payment amounts start accruing, or do you need to take steps to make sure that happens? Can you accelerate the facilities? And if you can, what are the consequences of doing that? Are you going to trip cross defaults under other documents and contracts to which the debtor's a party, which might create create a further problem for you? And you might also want to think about how you're going to organise. If you've got a lot of creditors, they might want to get together and form what's called a coordinating committee, and that's like a small group of creditors who will effectively negotiate the company. They won't be able to bind the other creditors, but they can be a useful sounding board. So you might want to think about setting that up, one of them up, and to think about who's on it that sort of best represents the footprint of the creditor community.
This is interesting, and we come into the dynamics now, I think. Obviously, there are certain steps, and you showed them on the slide, and we mentioned the principles on how this could run, but obviously there must be a wide scope between, and in your experience, processes that run smoothly and actually work out, and those that run into problems quite soon. What are the things you would say from your experience that affect dynamics of these processes and ideally could help make a successful one?
I'd say 1, 2, and 3 is probably stakeholders. To be honest, it's that dynamic of the stakeholders around the process and around the table. At the end of the day, it's a process, but people drive processes, and that is certainly true in a restructuring. So within that, you're looking at who are the shareholders and what is their liquidity position. That fundamentally is a very important point in a process. I guess from my experience, I'm not sure about Nikki, but debt restructuring alone rarely provides a long-term sustainable solution. Some form of equity support is generally needed, not always, but generally needed, whether it's stress or real distress, for a business to thrive again, which I think is an important point. I guess secondly, size of the debt spread. I think Nikki was talking there about coordinating committees. Key dynamic is how over leveraged is the business? I guess is an obvious question, but then is the debt syndicated, or is it a combination of multiple bilateral loans? Because if it's the latter, it can be much more complex and much more time consuming, I guess, to get around those lenders if you don't have a coordinating committee type function. Not all borrowers like the idea of getting all their creditors around the table. Some of them like to have that kind of bilateral relationship with the individual managers, and so there are pros and cons from both sides. But generally, having that coordinated creditor group can help. And the third point that I would make is the lender's provisioning policy, and some people can forget this, especially on the borrower side, can forget how important provisioning is for a lender, because a restructuring agreement may crystallize a need for a bad debt provision to be accounted for within the bank. And if a bank has to provide for a loan that has a material impact on its P&L, that is a very important factor, and borrowers really need to factor that in. You can't forget about that, and it can. I've seen it be a key differentiator between success and failure in a process. I guess the last point I'd make is probably the existence of personal guarantees. We see in this market much more personal guarantees being pledged collateral than we would maybe in the UK, for example. And I guess in my experience, it's very difficult for a lender to agree to a write-off, let alone a substantial change in terms of the debt, if they're holding a personal guarantee from an individual that they perceive to be extremely wealthy. It's very difficult for a lender in-house to agree to that, and that's just a fundamental fact. So again, that's something that needs to be factored in and considered.
Yeah, and I pick up on a point that you made there, and take it from both ends of the spectrum. So one is stakeholders, and I was just going to make it even narrower, which is it can sometimes be the human individuals that you're dealing with, and it sounds very small against the backdrop of all of these big picture points, but people's individual personalities, the players who are involved, can be really critical, and that is. I'm not saying that that's of course true in all negotiations for anything, but in the context of a restructuring, it can be really significant because people are often fearful for their jobs and their livelihoods, and that can be management team at the debtor who may be worried about whether their job is safe. It can also be the case of the creditors. If you've got someone who's originated a deal to a debtor and it's now in distress, their decisions may be subject to scrutiny as well. Sometimes with a debtor, you can spend quite a lot of time building up a relationship with your relationship banks, but then you get to a distress stage and they bring in a workout team. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for a debtor, because they'll be very familiar with the situation, they'll know what's going on. But equally, it can feel a bit adversarial. And from your perspective as a debtor, you can feel that just at the time you really need support of your banks, you've just had a complete regime change. And so that can be quite significant. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the economic backdrop, of course. It's difficult to restructure a construction company if there's not so much construction going on. And we're standing on the shifting sands of COVID-19 at the moment, and nobody knows how long it's going to go on, what the world's going to look like afterwards, how people are going to behave. And so that can really affect dynamics and timeline and process and what people are prepared to consider doing.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thanks. I just have one or two questions for you. Then we're going to start picking up on, we have a large number of very interesting questions coming in from the outside as well. But to wrap up the picture a little bit here, we've addressed the problems. I think we have identified the players now. If we put ourselves in the shoes of a company looking at this process, we have tried to understand and navigate some of the dynamics. I assume there are different ways of actually making this happen. What sort of options are we looking at?
Yeah, I'll probably take this one first. As we presented earlier, there are a wide range of options, and it's common for different solutions to be looked at and run in parallel. There's the simple amend and extend. There is some form of equity injection, asset disposal. One thing we're seeing more and more now in the market is people looking at fast track M&A. So selling parts of a business under an accelerated timeline to generate cash to put back into the business, which is very interesting in itself. And there's probably a few things just as we walk through these options is just to consider. And I guess one would be from a shareholder perspective. Again, sounds pretty simple, but if you have restricted levels of liquidity at this moment in time, it doesn't feel like the right time to be just funding operating losses in a distressed business if it looks like you'll have to be doing that indefinitely. So we're seeing shareholders kind of cut off the tap a little bit. But similarly from the lender side, we've seen lenders really struggle to convince internal credit committees and senior management about maybe putting new money into a business if the perception is, the phrase always, we're throwing good money after bad, which holds true, of course. And I think any substantial restructuring with no equity injection, from what we found, is it impacts the dynamics within the lender group, right? Because they see this debt equity dynamic being, when times are good, it's equity that derives that benefit. We've got a fixed rate of return here, and it's you guys that take the benefit. And when things don't go so well, I think there are lenders who sit there and think, well, now's the time for you to support. I think this is where a compromise just needs to be found. If we look externally, investors with cash and liquidity right now in today's market are probably looking at it as an opportunity. We've been approached as a firm many times by many investors looking at a situation now where the potential to get good quality assets for a discount. But of course, you look at the other side, sellers with good quality assets that are generating cash, that's the last part of the business they want to sell, because if a business unit or a certain part of your group or portfolio is cash generative and maybe funding other loss-making divisions or entities, by selling that entity, you're kind of sealing your fate. So again, that's an interesting dynamic that we're working through in the market. So I guess in terms of the various options, in summary, I would say, it's always been the case, a simple amend and extend with some form of short-term holiday or maybe capital repayment, principal repayment. That is the simplest solution and probably the most common and probably the most implementable. However, I think from our perspective, what we'd be very cautious about here is making sure it's not just a short-term fix. and that it is a sustainable solution, or has the potential to be a sustainable solution. Because what we've seen around the world, when you go through challenges such as this, and it's a patch job or a short-term fix, business turns into a kind of doctor state. And what I mean by that is it has kind of sufficient liquidity to survive, but maybe not enough to kind of invest and grow. And it doesn't have a balance sheet, because the balance sheet is still naturally over leveraged. That it doesn't attract. It's a balance sheet that doesn't attract new equity investment into the business. So I'm sure, Mark, as you can see, this is very challenging to kind of work your way through these options. But gladly, that's where Nikki and I have a role and have jobs to kind of help people through this process.
Thank you for that. On that note of your jobs in the process, now, Nikki, as a lawyer, you negotiate a lot of these processes. And once you're at a stage when the stakeholders, the creditors, have actually accepted an option or a combination of options, how do you go about making it happen?
Well, this is the interesting bit for the lawyers, to be honest. So, yeah, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning about doing the analysis around the relative rights of creditors. And of course, we put this up as a linear process. It's never linear. You're always building on it each as you go through. But you needing to look at the relative rights of creditors is really critical when it comes to implementation. So as the starting point, we will look at is, what do you want to do? Who needs to consent to that? And how easy or hard is it going to be to procure that consent? And plan A will always be to do a restructuring consensually with everybody consenting. That's just always going to be your preferred option. But sometimes it just isn't possible because people don't want to consent. And if that's not possible, then you need to think about what you're going to do about it and what's going to be your plan B. And that can be the time when it gets quite creative. So then from a legal perspective, we'll be thinking about what tools we've got available to us to develop an implementation plan. So that might be contractual tools. Can you tweak parts of the commercial or the legal proposal to implement the deal with a lower consent threshold than the optimal deal? It might be suboptimal, but is that going to be enough to get you there? And then if that doesn't work, then you might want to look at statutory tools, any statutory tools that you've got available to you. So they could be local. So just by way of example, we're in the ADGM. The ADGM has got a process under its company's regs, which is called a scheme of arrangement. And that allows a company to propose a restructuring, which will be binding on all of its creditors, if it's approved by a majority in number representing 75% by value of creditors of those class. So if you're able to access that, then that might be a useful means of getting over the 100% consent requirement. But we'll also look broader than that. We'll look overseas if we need to. Can you import tools from overseas? I qualified in 2010, and when I was a trainee in the insolvency team in London in 2009, we did the first scheme of arrangement of a foreign company, and that was how lots and lots of European and further afield companies restructured in the European market. They were European companies, but they accessed an English scheme of arrangement in order to restructure their debt, and they did it very, very successfully. And you also see companies accessing Chapter 11. It's not just US companies that access Chapter 11. And it may well be that they've done the analysis and they think that that's the best way of implementing restructuring. Possibly, might be other reasons, but it's possibly because of the cram down tools that it offers you. So there's obviously a lot of analysis that will need to be done about that. You'll need to be comfortable that you can access the tool, that it's going to be enforceable, that you're going to meet all of the jurisdictional requirements. But that's the sort of thing that you'll think about. And just to finish that off, I think one point worth mentioning is you might develop a plan B without ever intending to implement a plan B. Sometimes the very fact that you've got a developed and worked up plan B can be helpful in itself as a tool to drive a consensual solution where everyone consents, because the message you're giving to a minority holdout is we're going to do this deal anyway. So you can do it the easy way or the hard way. And if you do it the easy way, maybe we'll chuck you a bit or whatever. But it can just itself be a negotiation tool in terms of developing a consensual solution.
Yeah. One thing I'd just probably add to that, Nikki, I think when you're mentioning schemes of arrangement and ways of kind of bringing along creditors, I think Martin, that's just so important, because what you tend to find when you need 100% consent, then what you could have is a minority lender who has a relatively small exposure, who essentially just blocks a deal because they know they can. And inevitably what happens is a larger lender will just buy them out at 100% just to get them out of the process. And then what you end up having is, some lenders saying, well, I've had to take a haircut of X and this lender got out in Y and 100%, and therefore it just creates this tension that really the process doesn't need. The process is already challenging enough without lenders having inter-creditor arguments. So to the extent you have some of these legal implementation tools available, they really are super effective in driving a process. So long may the ADGM kind of promote that and provide more framework to do these kind of deals.
That's gone muffled for me. Is that?
Yeah, I'm still here, Nikki. I think Martin is present.
I think Martin was asking a question, and I'm not totally sure what question he's asking, but as I can see questions coming up the side, shall we just answer one?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think one of the first questions that came up was, what's the difference between restructurings in the West and the MENA region? And the reason I just wanted to pick up on that is because I think it leads quite nicely from the conversation that we were just having around implementation tools, because I think that is one of the differences. But there are a few. The first one is approach. I think it can be a bit different here. There's cultural differences in the way that people perceive distress and perceive restructurings that it's not always the same in the West. And that's not to say they don't exist in the West, but you look at Chapter 11, for example. I mean, there's some companies that just keep going into Chapter 11. No one's got any issues with it. They just go in, they come out the other side, and no one has a problem with it. Whereas culturally, it's a bit different here. There's not quite the history of it, and it's a new jurisdiction in that perspective. So, that will take a little bit of time. I think banks will have different perspectives on things, maybe different perspectives on things like provisioning. And that can make a difference. Some of the dynamics that we talked about earlier are relevant here. As Tom's already mentioned, you quite often get personal guarantees here, and that can change how people react to things and how people handle themselves in the restructuring. The other big picture point is legal tools. I mean, we were just talking about those legal tools, and it's obviously an evolving jurisdiction in that respect. And it's a civil law jurisdiction as well, which is quite different from the sort of common law background that I've come from. And so that makes things a little bit different. And it can be a bit harder to import overseas tools. But you think of how things are developing there. You look at the ADGM. That's a modern jurisdiction. It's new, but it's offering lots of possibilities for people. And that might well change things. And changes that ADGM are making, like adjustments to the founding law, that potentially reinforces the links between ADGM courts and the onshore courts, which I think has potential to be helpful in the context of a restructuring. So Martin, I think you're back. I don't know whether that's the question you asked. I just picked one from the feed, but
it wasn't. It was an important question and a good answer. Well, my question was rather about employees. Now, they cost money. You as a company might own the money, but on the other hand, your future relies on them. What is your view on how to deal well with staff in these sort of situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few points there, Martin. I think typically when you're starting a restructuring process such as this, I guess from the company, it's I guess confined to very senior management. It starts off as a C-suite and board discussion, and I think companies in general are quite cognizant of not letting this kind of news slip out too easily, because I think it can be a bit disheartening. It can be distracting for employees as a whole. And I do think, once you're going through that process, keeping it tight knit, that there are advantages to do that. Now, clearly, once you are going through that process of the business planning type exercise that I talked about, as you said, staff costs for many companies is the biggest cost within their business. And if you're in a situation where you're looking at COVID now, how many sectors right now have zero control over their top line? A lot. So there's always that old adage of sometimes you can't control your top line, but you can control your cost base. And I think that's where people are forced into a situation where you have to assess every line of that cost base, and staff costs are like no other. A couple of things that we constantly find through that business planning process is number one, yes, it's a very easy decision to say, these employees cost me this much, and if I take them out, then that's a direct saving. I think you've always got to consider that in a restructuring, normally there is a liquidity situation, and if employees are terminated, simply it crystallizes end of service benefits. So you have to model that, you have to plan for that. And that doesn't sound the most heartfelt message message in the world. But then there's also the piece around, particularly relevant in this market is, COVID won't be around forever. We're talking about, is it temporary or semi-permanent? How long is it going to last for? It's not going to last forever. And I think the businesses that can retain their top talent through this process are going to be the ones that thrive thereafter. And so therefore that's, you really have to think about it on a holistic situation, not just looking at a line of costs and saying, what can we take out?
Good, thank you for that. Another question that has come in, interesting angle here. Michael saying that corporate debt restructuring is somewhat like a long-running mediation. He mentions that ADGM courts are keen to promote mediation. Is there a role, in your experience, for a mediator when bumps in the road are encountered in these sort of processes?
Do you want me to take that, Tom?
Yeah, go.
I would think so, and I can't say that it's necessarily done that often, but I think there is scope, and I think one thing that is quite interesting is that there are a number of jurisdictions which have pre-insolvency processes. So these are sort of formal processes before you've got into a proper insolvency situation, that where you've effectively got an independent third party who comes in effectively to facilitate a negotiation. So they may not be called a mediator, but I would be surprised if they weren't trained mediators, because that is effectively what they're doing. And they're trying to broker a situation between creditors when you've got a deadlock, but you haven't necessarily hit the point of no return where, for example, the directors feel that they have to file. So there's examples of that in lots of different jurisdictions, actually. In fact, to be fair, including the UAE, the UAE's introduced, the onshore regime has introduced something called a financial restructuring committee, which is a committee which is partly there to oversee the implementation of the law and supervise the infrastructure that sits behind the federal insolvency law. But one of the roles that it does have is that it's able to oversee out-of-court restructurings of licensed institutions. So, and in that situation, you would have someone who's appointed to effectively facilitate those negotiations. Now, they might be, people who would otherwise take an appointment in an insolvency process. So like some kind of insolvency practitioner, or maybe a firm of accountants or lawyers who might facilitate that process. But they are effectively mediators, just not in the sort of formal sense of the word. So I think, and I think across the globe, those sort of processes have been very successful in terms of fending off more serious situations. So I think there is potential there.
The only thing I would add, Nick, is I don't know about you, but I think when you're at the heart of a restructuring process as a legal advisor or lead financial advisor, I certainly feel like a mediator at times, and I'm sure you as well, Nikki. So maybe not in the formal sense of the word, as you say, but I guess that's hopefully the role of an advisor is to keep the process on the tracks and provide both. Even if you're representing one side, you still know that by kind of counselling the other side, it could help. It helps all parties and therefore your client. So you are performing that role as such, but yeah, I think if when things really start to derail, if you have a kind of legal process, real independent third party to go to, that's only going to add value.
Interesting. Please keep the questions coming. We will get to them all, I hope. Here's an interesting one coming in for you, Tom. Considering the recent misreporting by some companies, what can banks do differently, according to this question, to ensure there is no misreported debt? And I assume we can answer even broader than from a bank perspective on this one, if you want to address it.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously been well-reported cases of this, and it's a significant issue for sure. I guess I can only kind of answer this from the perspective of, if you look at some other jurisdictions, you have central registers of debt that is open and accessible to everyone. It's a public record. So by having that kind of schedule, it might not necessarily have amounts, but it'll at least show lender, type of facility, and security. And I think with that kind of infrastructure, it gives people comfort of who the various lenders are. I think generally, as a market moves away from bilateral lending to syndicated lending, that kind of clears up on its own, because within a syndicate you get visibility of the other exposures within that syndicate, and obviously if you look at the balance sheet and you see that the numbers overall match, then there's no additional debt. But other than that, if you're in a bilateral relationship with today's ecosystem, you are to a certain extent reliant on the auditors, and as part of any audit process, they should be writing to all lenders of the company, all lenders of record, and asking for confirmation of the exposures, both on balance sheet and off balance sheet. We shouldn't forget about the off balance sheet exposures as well. They're super important. So that is essentially the auditor's job, to request those confirmations and make sure that reconciles with the company. But again, being very open and honest, if you have a company that misreports debts to its board, misreports debt to its auditors, hides banking relationships from everyone, that is fraud at the end of the day. And it's very difficult to identify and catch fraud if it's well hidden. But no, I think they are the main tools available to identify it. And then otherwise, you're in the world of lenders needing to talk to each other and share some information with each other, which also has its confidentiality issues as well. So again, not an easy one, but I think especially in this market, it seems to be heading in the right direction.
Thank you, Nick and Tom. I hope it's okay with both of you to spend a couple of minutes more here, because we have some really interesting questions left. I'd like to hear your views on. Here is one, Nikki, perhaps for you, from Schwab. Should the IBOR transition take a back seat for now, as corporates are already busy bringing business back to normal and don't want another roadblock?
It's a tricky one. I mean, I think there's an element of, even before we got to COVID-19, that people were wondering whether there was going to be a delay to the implementation of IBOR reform. And the regulatory authorities in the UK have been very clear that they were not going to do that. I mean, it's kind of difficult. We are in totally unprecedented times now, and so and there's obviously a lot to do. We're still looking at solutions to deal with the issues in a variety of different debt instruments. They are so complex, and the issues that banks are dealing with are so significant, and the amount of work that they need to do in order to get to a position where they are able to cope with the end of IBOR is problematic. So, do I think they should? Maybe it would be helpful, but I lack the powers to make that happen, unfortunately.
Good, thank you. Then we have an interesting suggestion here that would, I think, be very interesting to get your views on. The suggestion is for companies to reserve money to pay salaries, say for, according to the suggestion, a 6-month period, putting that aside separating it as far as they can to make sure that they can take care of the payroll. Is this something that can be done? Is this something that's good to do?
Can we have the first go, Nikki? I think this is getting to the heart of, should there be some cash aside to at least pay salaries if the business hits a significant issue and financial distress? Then it's a lovely idea. I think it would certainly help, and it would give, I guess, employees more confidence in their jobs and greater stability. And I think for this market, that's very important. I guess the challenge will always be from a company side. That could be a very substantial number. And given where, if we're looking at this today, the liquidity position of many companies probably couldn't afford this. And if you look at the cost of overall cost of capital, that would be a very expensive move to make. And I think that the shame in a lot of these things are, we think of these good ideas when we're in the eye of the storm, and when it's probably the worst time to put this money aside. And I think we shouldn't be talking about this now. We should be talking about this when the economy's booming and businesses are doing well and everyone's making tons of profits. It's at that point that we should be thinking about, well, how do we create some buffers, if you like. We've seen the banks go through it and creating capital buffers within the banks, and they did that through the good times of the kind of last 10 years or so since the last financial crisis, and it's meant that if you look globally now, the banks appear to be much more robust to this type of shock than they were in 2008. So I think, yes, it's a good idea. Is it something that should be enforced on companies right now? I think it would be a bit unfair. And therefore, it should be, these sorts of things should be thought about when the going's good, and then we can kind of squirrel some away and build up that buffer. I'm sure there's an anecdote about a squirrel during summer collecting nuts and putting them away for winter.
Stay away from the anecdotes.
When you're in the middle of winter, it's a bit difficult, right?
Yeah.
Another question here, and it might go outside the scope of a restructuring process, but what support is out there, and what incentive, what help is being provided by government to help companies avoid being in the situation and if and when they find themselves in distress to get out of it?
It's quite a big question, actually. There's quite a lot of support. There's quite a big package of support arrangements. So it's probably easier to take that one offline where we can give something comprehensive. But there are quite a lot. So things like they have the central banks introduced this targeted economic support scheme, and that provides a range of support measures for banks to support businesses. There's a relaxation in things like registration requirements and registration fees that are payable at authorities. There's relaxation in visa renewal requirements. So it's quite extensive. In fact, I picked up a sort of summary deck internally before this call to have a look through what the latest position was, and the summary deck's about 50 pages long, so it's quite extensive. But so happy to take that one offline.
Tom, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I probably should plug that on our Deloitte website there is a schedule and outline of all government initiatives across the world, and the GCC region is covered on that. So I'd implore people to kind of go and have a look at that. But yeah, like Nikki said, one of the first moves very early on was central bank kind of releasing or reducing some of the restrictions around capital and freeing up some capital within the banks, which I think was a very effective move, because obviously it's simple and it's effective, because when a company hits in some kind of financial distress, one of the first stakeholders they will naturally speak to will probably be their bank. So if you can as a country make that easier across the banking system and provide a little bit more flexibility, that makes each of those conversations just that little bit easier, which does make a big difference. And as Nikki said, there's various kind of rental reliefs and changes in terms for what businesses can do around their employees and various other things. So there's a very long list, very long list, and what's being done. And I guess the other point I make here is that very much like if you look at this from a health perspective, the social distancing, the lockdown, what was that trying to achieve? It was trying to flatten the curve, and I think that's exactly what governments, and the UAE government is doing it as well, but governments around the world are trying to flatten that economic curve as well by providing this stimulus. It may create a situation where we're still facing these challenges in the months and perhaps hopefully not, but years ahead. But it's avoiding a bell curve crisis right now, which we've all seen from the last financial crisis is absolutely the right thing to do.
And if I can just add, as an answer to this question, as you said, both of you said, there are many initiatives both to help avoid or delay cost, whether that's for real estate registration, lightening certain compliance requirements, for example, to allow companies to focus more on business making, and on the other hand, more revenue-focused support, such as easier market access. There is the in-country value program in Abu Dhabi now, where companies, at least in government tenders, get better score by actually being here, meaning that you have a greater chance to win this businesses here. We have, if you follow this webcast series going on, a number of more sessions focused on these areas. So we have speakers, for example, from Abu Dhabi Investment Office that coordinates a number of industry support programs. We have the Department of Economic Development talking about some of their incentives. So there will be much more discussion about various angles on how companies can behave to avoid distress as much as possible, or if you find yourselves there, find that way out, create that good future to convince your creditors and others that you're worth the wait. I think with that we have covered the questions we have gotten sent to us. Nikki or Tom, I don't know if you have any parting words you want to share by way of summing up the discussion so far.
Well, from my perspective, I would just say, a financial restructuring, it always sounds a bit scary, but we consider ourselves very much the A&E of the legal world. We're not the Grim Reapers at all, and I think getting on top of the situation early and getting advice is the best thing that you can do if you're dealing with that kind of situation. And Tom and I are always happy to chat through things with people. So that would be my parting shot.
Yeah, absolutely. Echo that. I guess from our side, a conversation is always free. I don't know if I'm sounding Nicola up to something. She's not on there. But, from our perspective, that's what we enjoy doing, right? We enjoy engaging with lenders, with companies, with management teams, with shareholders in the market, and discussing and brainstorming these issues. They can be, as you said, Nikki, quite scary and uncharted territory. but they are interesting situations and complex, and it requires people getting around a table and coming up with some creative solutions. And there's no shortage of qualified people in this market to help support with that.
Well, thank you very much, Nikki and Tom. I think this has been a very enlightening discussion. You've shed light on this really important option, this tool that unfortunately more and more companies need to think of, but you've taken away, I think, a lot of the question marks around it, making me at least, and I hope many of the people who listen, feel that this is something we understand better, something we can think of in an informed way and have these discussions in our companies with our trusted advisors and with key stakeholders as well. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise on this. To the audience, thank you for listening. We will, as promised, go on to the social media channels and try to may have missed. But again, thank you very much, and see you in a few days, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nick.